I'm with Robert Bryce, the author of Cronies, Oil, the Bushes, and the Rise of Texas as America's Superstate. Thank you for joining us in The Connection.
Thank you for having me.
Why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote this book because as I finished my first book on Enron, Pipe Dreams, I realized that there was more story to be written here. I looked at Enron and I thought, well, what was it about this company that had made it such a power politically and in business and so on? And so I began looking at all these different things about Texas. What was it about Texas that gave Texas such dominance in America? Why was it that 2 of the last 3 presidents and 3 of the last 8 have been Texans? And as I looked at aerospace, I looked at the radio business, I realized it all comes back to energy. It really does. It's about the energy story here in Texas. And as I looked at Lyndon Johnson and both George Bushes, it was clear that they would never have risen to power but for the backing of the Texas energy business. So that's where I really began to focus. And as I looked at different parts of that, the parallels between Ross Sterling's involvement in sending the Texas National Guard into the East Texas field in 1931 and the oil politics of today really spoke to me as a story that needed to be told.
And tell me about Ross Sterling. He was the governor that ordered this to happen. Why did he do it, and what were the consequences of doing that?
Sure. Well, Sterling's a fascinating character in a lot of ways in Texas history because he was a feed store operator. He got into the oil business early on, became the first president of Humble Oil, which is now known as ExxonMobil. And in 1930, the East Texas field was discovered. Dad Joyner drilled a well in an area that all the oil experts were convinced had no oil. And Joyner ended up discovering what became the biggest oil field ever discovered up to that time. Well, massive amounts of oil started flowing onto the market because the East Texas field was giant and hugely prolific. And so oil prices went from $1 or so per barrel in 1930 to as little as 3 cents in the East Texas field.
Too much supply.
Too much supply. Sterling, who had been in the oil business, had a lot of people that he knew in the oil business, including his brother, who worked for Humble Oil, were pressuring him, saying, you have to do something. You have to take some action here to control this massive flow of oil. Otherwise, we're going to have calamity. And it was the state was bordering on calamity in the oil fields. So Sterling sent the Texas National Guard into the East Texas field, declared martial law. He really didn't have authority to do so, but he did so anyway. The National Guard shut down production in the East Texas field for weeks, and oil prices rallied. That set the stage for the empowerment of the Texas Railroad Commission, which then, for the next 4 decades, set world oil prices. What
was his excuse to take over the oil fields?
Well, his excuse was that the situation was bordering on insurrection, that the producers were not abiding by rules that were set by the state, and that he had no choice. So he took action, and it was effective. What's remarkable is that it was really at very little cost, and that there were no guardsmen were hurt. It was fairly peaceful.
What do you think is wrong with Texas being the energy state and therefore the most powerful state in the United States? I mean, what's wrong with cronism? What's wrong with that?
Well, first, I don't think, my job as a journalist is not to say this is good or bad. It's simply to say, here are the facts. This is what has happened. Cronies is really a discussion of how this happened, why America has become, or Texas has become America's superstate. That's a term that wasn't coined by me. It was coined by Karl Rove, George W. Bush's political advisor. So what's wrong with it? I don't necessarily see anything wrong with it. But what we are seeing now is, I think, in America, Texas exporting its model, its governmental model, which is low taxes, low services, and what that will mean for America, I think, is an important issue, and it's a discussion that I think needs to take place.
Now, you said that in 1948, when President Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, won the elective office, the transformation of Texas from a Democratic state to a Republican state began. How did that happen?
Sure. Peter O'Donnell is a Dallas businessman who's been a high-profile Republican for many years. I interviewed him in the writing of Cronies. And, of course, the history of the 48 election, where Johnson takes the election from Coke Stevenson by 87 votes in a disputed election in which many people believe Johnson stole the election. Well, O'Donnell and many other, O'Donnell was a young man at that time, but many of the very conservative Texas Democrats were backing Coke Stevenson, including a group called the Texas Regulars. Many members of the Texas Regulars were affiliated with with major oil companies. They were affiliated with different power groups. But the Texas Regulars became very disenchanted with the Texas Democratic Party after the '48 race because they felt that Johnson had betrayed them and that he had cheated. That and a number of other events laid the groundwork for the creation of the Texas Republican Party, because that really was the final straw for the Texas Regulars and the real conservative Texas Democrats, and they began pushing for the creation and the empowerment of a really viable Texas Republican Party, and that's the beginning.
Now, you also, throughout your book, you talk about relationships between, business and government. One of the relationships that was interesting because of Halliburton today was the Brown and Root relationship with Johnson. If you could, Lyndon Johnson, the former president, explain that relationship, how that started and how that evolved to what it is today.
Sure. George and Herman Brown were businessmen, and they had become acquainted with Lyndon Johnson in the 1930s. In 1937, James Buchanan died, and Buchanan had a seat in the U.S. House. Johnson ran for that open seat. He ran and got the backing of George and Herman Brown, largely because the Browns needed Johnson's help in Washington. At that time, the Browns were building, their company, Brown and Root, was building the Mansfield Dam on the Colorado River outside of Austin. The dam project was stalled because the Bureau of Reclamation, which was funding the project, realized that the dam was not sitting on federal land. The federal government didn't own the property on which the dam was being built. So they said, well, why are we paying all this money to build a dam on property we don't own? So they halted funding. Well, and the Browns at that time had mortgaged themselves up to their eyeballs. They were road builders. This was their first major project. Johnson agreed that if he won, he would go to Washington and push through the funding. Well, it's exactly what happened. 11 days after LBJ got to Washington as a new member of the U.S. House, he was able to secure funding for the Mansfield Dam, and for the Browns, that project made them rich. It made Brown and Root. That was the basis of their empire. It made them rich. It allowed them to get into government contracting and do dam building and essentially leave the road building business behind. And that was the key to their relationship, which then lasted for the next 40 years.
Now, I understand the U.S. Corps of Engineers used to do a lot of work, for example, during wartime, restructuring, rebuilding. But that was privatized. When did that happen, and how does it affect the relationship between a company like Brown and Root or Halliburton and the U.S. government?
Sure. Well, the U.S. government in the military has always used contractors for various things, and Brown and Root did a lot of governmental contracting before World War II and during World War II, building bases, building ships for the military. That all changed, though, during Vietnam. Brown and Root became one of the main contractors in a consortium of companies that was involved in Vietnam, doing billions of dollars worth of construction. Now, this was a radical change for the Pentagon. In the past, during a time of war, in a theater of war, it was the Seabees, or the U.S. Corps of Engineers, who did all the construction work, built the air bases, built the water treatment plants, built facilities for the troops. In Vietnam, the Pentagon hired this consortium, including Brown and Root, to do this work in Vietnam. It was the first time private contractors had ever been used in a theater of war by the Pentagon. And that begins this really fundamental change in how the federal government dealt with Brown and Root, which at that time, in 1962, became part of Halliburton. Changed that relationship, and that relationship between Halliburton and the U.S. government became closer and closer until today in Iraq we see the result.
Don't they do a better job than the government would have?
Well, that's part of the argument, right? And that part of the argument, of course, in military is always the issue of tooth to tail, right? How much fighting force can we have on the ground versus support personnel? Is it better to have more people carrying guns than wielding spatulas and flipping, flapjacks? Well, that's the argument, of course, and it also is one of cost. If we can pay these private contractors, maybe they can do it cheaper than the Pentagon itself can do. I think that argument is one that is still not clearly won by either side. I think that in some cases in Iraq, we're seeing now that Halliburton's costs are higher than what it would be if the military itself was doing it. So I think that's still open for discussion.
Now, you call, there's a term that you use, the six-pack. Tell me who the six-pack are, and why is it wrong, do you think, to mix oil with politics?
Well, the six-pack, Ray Hunt, the Dallas oil billionaire who's been a big supporter of the Bushes for many years, James A. Baker III, Houston resident, former Secretary of State, long ally of the Bushes, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Ken Lay, Dick Cheney. Those men have been extraordinarily successful in wielding political power in America over the past 2 decades. That's the Texas six-pack that I refer to in cronies. Now, what is their role? Well, I think that, there is no politics and business have long been intertwined. What we're seeing today, though, and the reason that I wrote this book, and I use the term cronies, is that what we're seeing now is a mixing of business and politics, and oil and politics, and oil and the military, to a degree we've never seen in America. And I think that has dangers to it, in that, for instance, with Halliburton, yes, they're doing a job for the military, but they're also an oil field services contractor. So the question becomes, at what point is it business and at what point is it government? I'm all for business and I'm all for government. I just don't want them to be the same thing.
Now, in your book, you go into why we went to war with Iraq.
Sure.
What did you find in your research?
Well, I begin the book with the first battle of the Second Iraq War, which I think is really an important way to look at our involvement there. The very first battle begins March 19th, March 20th of 2003, when a group of Navy SEALs attack the Mina al-Bakr oil terminal on the Persian Gulf. Now, this is a critical bit of infrastructure for Iraq, because this is their main export terminal. More oil flows through Mina al-Bakr than any other. Whoever controls Iraq's oil controls Iraq's destiny. That's a line from Anas al-Haji. If you control the oil, you control the country. Well, America's military decided this is going to be the very first place that we put our troops in harm's way. This is going to be the first battle. Well, oil then is the focus. If oil is the first battle, then oil must be one of the key issues here. Further, what's interesting about Mina al-Bakr is that it was built by Halliburton in the mid-1970s, at a time when the United States did not have diplomatic relations with Iraq. There are a lot of reasons that have been stated for the Second Iraq War. Weapons of mass destruction, promoting democracy, etc. The fact is, we didn't invade Iraq because they export broccoli. The issue here is energy. America's fundamental security economic interest in the Persian Gulf has been oil, and it will be oil for a long time to come.
Well, isn't that the reality of our economy, that we are dependent on oil and on cheap oil to thrive as an economy?
Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons why Texas has become such a dominant state. For decades, beginning in the 1930s, really through the 1970s, Texas had what appeared to be an inexhaustible supply of oil. And in fact, George H.W. Bush, was a critical player in the push to keep out foreign oil from coming into the United States, keep too much foreign oil, because it was cheaper than domestically produced oil. Now we're in a situation where Texas is still the largest producer of oil domestically, still the largest producer of gas domestically, more than Alaska, still the biggest refiner, biggest transporter, and biggest supplier of technology, finance, and so on to America and the world. But that said, now the tables have changed. I mean, the equation has changed. America is importing increasing amounts of oil, and increasingly that oil is in the Persian Gulf. Our fundamental overriding interest now to keep America's economy healthy is making sure that no one else can impede the flow of that oil, and that is America's Achilles heel.
Why do you think it's an Achilles heel? Because we have to make sure that we get that oil whichever way.
Well, I think it's fairly obvious. Now, we're spending $1 billion a week keeping American troops in Iraq. That's a lot of money. If you look at Iraq today, where are the insurgents? Where is al-Qaeda attacking America in Iraq? They're attacking the oil infrastructure. And by doing so, they are hampering then, for the short term and I think the long term, the ability of the new Iraqi government to stay in power. If they don't have money, if they can't secure the situation, if there's long gas lines, if there's no electricity, there's no stability. And why then are the insurgents in Saudi Arabia attacking oil infrastructure? Because they know that's the way to disrupt the world economy, but more importantly, the American economy.
You talk about Iraq and Iran in the past, and the relationship, for example, between Saddam Hussein and Brown and Root.
Sure.
What is that about?
Well, I mentioned earlier the issue of Mina al-Bakr being built in the 1970s by Brown and Root and Halliburton. Well, that relationship then begins at that time, but then it continues through the 1980s. During the first days of the Iran-Iraq War, the Iranians attacked Mina al-Bakr and another offshore platform, a loading platform called Khor al-Amaya, and they damaged both of them. Well, shortly after that damage occurred, Saddam Hussein's government then contacts Brown and Root and says, we need your help to get these oil platforms or oil terminals up and running again. So as the Iran-Iraq War is raging, engineers working for Halliburton began working on plans to get these oil terminals back up and running as soon as possible. Within days of the end of the Iran-Iraq War, in 1988, Brown and Root engineers are back on both of these platforms, looking to get them recommissioned. And in fact, they begin that work and continue that work and are on those platforms on August 15th of 1990 when Saddam Hussein's troops roll into Kuwait. And these engineers realize, oh, well, our country's being, we're now at war with this country who is our host country, and they got on their boats off of Mina al-Bakr and simply sailed away.
Let's talk about Iran, and Iran's in the news right now,
Sure.
and there is a long-term relationship between the United States and Iran that a lot of Americans may not know about. Tell me about that, and who was Mossadegh?
Mossadegh was the democratically elected prime minister of Iran. And in the 1950s, he was a nationalist. He felt that the Iranians were not getting a fair shake from British Petroleum, Anglo-Iranian as it was known at that time, for the oil that was being produced out of Iran. And in fact, the interesting bit of history is that the British Navy really kind of took over Iran because they realized that they wanted to have a oil-fueled Navy, and the Iranian and the Persian Gulf or Persian oil deposits were a key part of their ability to project power around the globe. Well, Mossadegh began agitating and saying that the British were not giving the Iranians a fair shake. The CIA got involved. Long story short, Kermit Roosevelt, who was a nephew of Teddy Roosevelt, engineered a CIA-backed coup that threw out Mossadegh, even though he was democratically elected, and replaced him with the Shah. They brought the Shah in, they put him in power, and shortly after that, British Petroleum and a consortium of American oil companies got the exclusive rights to drill for oil in Iran. And those companies then had a very good deal with the Shah for the next 30-odd years. An interesting sidelight, and one of the things that I thought was, in my research, was kind of the most amazing, was that in the mid-1970s, the oil contract for drilling, rather, in Iran was held by a company named Said Iran. Now, that's only important because in 1973, Bill Clements, who in 1978 becomes governor of Texas, first Republican elected in Texas in over 100 years, Bill Clements was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. He was appointed to that position by Richard Nixon because he had been a big supporter of Nixon's here in Texas. So Clements becomes the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Shortly after he takes office, the Export-Import Bank provides a loan that allows Clements' company, a drilling company called Sedco, to go into business with the Shah of Iran in a drilling venture in Iran. So for nearly all of Clements' tenure in the Pentagon, as the second most powerful man at the Pentagon, he is, for all intents and purposes, business partners with the Shah of Iran.
Now, you mentioned Halliburton's contract in this war.
Sure.
Did not have a competitive bid. It was up to $7 billion. To help in the rehabilitation and the infrastructure. Sure. Why were there, you think, no bids? And could there be another company that does what Halliburton does so well?
Well, why there were not other bids is still, I think, being speculated upon. For the Corps of Engineers, the explanation that they've given is that there weren't other companies that had the kind of skills that Halliburton needed, that this was the only company that could step into the breach and deal with fixing pipelines, fixing oil wells, putting out oil well fires, providing logistics services for the U.S. military, delivering fuel for the Humvees and the tanks, all of these things, that Halliburton was the only company with the global reach. They operate in more than 100 countries, able to provide the kind of services that the Pentagon wanted. I think that there are other companies that probably could have done that, but it appears that the Corps of Engineers says, well, let's give it to Halliburton and let them farm it out, let them do all this work, and that way we'll get this operation moving faster. Now, the question ultimately becomes one of, well, is this a good deal for the American taxpayer? And now we know the Pentagon has begun numerous audits of Halliburton's work to try and figure out, well, was this a good deal for the taxpayers? And I think some of those questions are still to be answered. But I think the more important question is, again, this blurring of the line between business and government. Where does Halliburton's interest end and the military's interest end? Or are they the same? And if they're the same, is that really what we want in American foreign policy? To have on the front lines of our fighting force and our military and our energy force to be the same thing. And I fear that that's what has happened, is that in fact now America's energy policy and our foreign policy and our military policy have become the same thing.
In your chapter on oil, you also mention a key pipeline coming out of Iraq. Why is that important?
The Kirkuk to Ceyhan line. Well, it's critically important for Iraq to be able to export oil. We talked about Min al-Bakr, the terminal that ends in the Persian Gulf. The line from Kirkuk to Ceyhan in Turkey is critically important because that's one of the only ways to get oil out of the Kirkuk fields in the north to markets. Well, what's happened is that the insurgents and the opponents of America and the opponents of the new government in Iraq realize that that pipeline is one of America's Achilles' heels, and they have been bombing it repeatedly. In fact, it was just bombed again late last week and has been out of commission for several days. And they are bombing the pipelines faster than the Americans and the Iraqis can repair them.
Now, in your last chapter, the United States of Texas, you give some dire statistics about Texas. I'll mention some of them. First, in the number of citizens incarcerated. First in executions. First in adults and children without health insurance. First in overall number of firearm deaths and children killed by guns. First in smog, and you go on to mention more. Yet we are still the most powerful political state in the United States. How can that be?
Well, I think it's in part because Texas has always had this stratification of society. I mean, every state does, right? The very rich and the very poor. I think what we see, though, in Texas is that, for many reasons, we don't have a state income tax, so the wealthiest citizens don't have to pay taxes at the same level that the poorest citizens do. That helps foster this underclass, a growing underclass. That has no political power and whose destinations are low-wage jobs, prison, crime, etc. In addition, I think that Texas dominance is more than just this economic issue. One of the things that I'm from Oklahoma, so I'm not a native-born Texan, but to see this pride of place in Texas, I think it's more prominent here than perhaps any other state. Texans, and I've talked with several members of Congress, former House Speaker Jim Wright, members of the Texas delegation in Congress always see themselves as Texans first and Americans second. I think maybe that's true for Texans generally, is that they have a pride of place, a belief that this dominance of Texas, the fact that Texas was a nation before it was a state, all of these things play into this broader idea and this broader focus on the state and its belief that somehow its destiny is more manifest than any other states.
And yet it is having all these social problems. And your concern in writing this book was that will not be exported to the rest of the country. Well,
whether it's being exported or not, that's, I think, is we're seeing whether, in fact, that is happening, whether we're getting more tax breaks for the rich or whether the conditions for the poor are getting better. The issue for me is where is this leading us? If Texas, for instance, the new statistic came out just a couple of weeks ago that now Texas is dead last in the percentage of the population who have graduated from high school. Well, that's, to me, yes, first in incarceration, first in murders, first in firearm deaths. All of these things are scary, but ultimately the question becomes, is this model sustainable? Can the state, and if we're exporting this model to the rest of the United States, can this model survive where we have such a large population that is undereducated, underserved with health care? To me, I worry that this becomes a ruinous policy that ultimately will cause bankruptcy, either moral or financial, for the state, and then possibly for the rest of the country.
Now, You are concerned about this cronyism network, and you say that it is more corrosive to our system of democratic capitalism than it should be. What should Americans know about this, and why should they care?
Well, I think they should care because many of them don't know who these people are. For instance, why is it that after James Baker III helped in the Florida recount and really, I think, assured George W. Bush's victory there? Well, many plum positions from the George Bush's White House then went to Baker Botts, James Baker's law firm. For instance, Robert Jordan became the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Well, now he is back in the United States. He's left that position, but he has begun advising businesses on how to do business in Saudi Arabia. I think what's important here is let's look at the revolving door. Let's look at this connection and these multiple interconnections between the government and the business, and I think have that discussion. Is this really healthy? Is this really what America is this really good for American democracy or bad? And I think ultimately it can become very worrisome when we have an entrenched group of people who are part of this crony network who simply go from government to business to government and back, and ultimately we don't know what their interests are or whose interests they're serving. Why is it that Dick Cheney is still getting paychecks, deferred compensation, from Halliburton when he's the sitting Vice President of the United States?
We have to end it there. Thank you so much, Mr. Robert Bryce, author of Cronism. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.